Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Timing is everything. So why don't we pay more attention to the when decisions in our lives? New York Times bestselling author Daniel Pink joins me today to talk about his new book, When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. Dan and I dig into the fascinating research and data, and Dan shares the practical takeaways that will literally change your life. When is the best time to hold a meeting? When should I take breaks? When should I go to the gym? When is the best time of day based on the way that I'm wired to do certain kinds of work? Dan answers all these questions and more, revealing how we can systematically make better, smarter timing decisions. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Daniel Pink. Dan Pink, thank you so much for coming on. It means so much to me, and just super grateful for our time. And we're going to talk about your new book. Does that sound good?
Sounds great, Molly. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's truly an honor. So, I wanted to talk to you about your new book, which is called When: The Hidden Science of Timing. So, to kind of steal a question from your own podcast, what's sort of the big idea here?
Yeah, the big idea here is that we tend to think that timing, that is all of the when decisions we make in our life. We make a lot of when decisions in our life. Or when should we go to the gym? When should I do certain kinds of work? When should we abandon a project? When should we get going on a project? And we tend to make those decisions based on intuition and guesswork because we think timing is an art. The big idea, Molly, is that timing is really a science. There's a rich body of research that if we go into it wide enough and deep enough, we can make systematically better, smarter, shrewder, evidence-based decisions about when to do stuff.
Well, and I have loved the book, by the way.
Thanks.
It's to your point, so deep and so wide, right? I mean, as you think about the word when, I guess so many of these things that I have read in the book and the thoughts and the ideas that you shared are so deep and so wide. So let me ask you this: when you were doing the research for the book, what is something that really surprised you? Something that really surprised you, maybe the most?
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises in this book, actually. In other books that I've written, I had a sense of, okay, I think I know where this is going. I think I know what the architecture of it is. This one, I really just started with a question, which is, what do we know about timing? So I was surprised left and right again. So among the surprises were just how big the time of day affects our performance. I had an inkling that it was important. I didn't realize how important, nor did I realize how systematic the rhythm of the day was and how much we could do about putting the right work at the right time. I was blown away by the evidence on breaks. It really changed my behavior. And I was really taken by some of the research on how groups synchronize in time, particularly how, things like rowing teams or choirs, how much synchronizing with other people seems to be really deep-seated in human nature, a big element of who we are, which to me was another revelation. So I got surprised all over the place in this book.
Wow. Well, how has it changed the way you behave and how you live your life every day?
Yeah, a number of different ways. So let me give you two examples here. I guess the biggest example would be breaks. I was someone who very rarely took breaks because I felt like it was better to power through. And once I read the research on breaks, which is really extraordinary, I really did change my ways. I really think that the research on breaks is where the research on sleep was maybe 15 years ago. That is, we didn't really understand how important sleep was 15 years ago. So people did crazy things like pulling all-nighters or being sleep deprived. Once we understood the science of sleep, we said, okay, wait a second, don't do that. Don't do an all-nighter. Don't be sleep deprived. Sleep is actually part of your performance. And I think the same thing is happening with breaks. The research on breaks is really powerful. And I had it completely wrong. I mean, you know this probably better than most people from having worked with athletes, but I had it completely wrong in that my view, even like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was that, all right, I get it. Amateurs take breaks and professionals don't. And that's completely the opposite. It's that amateurs don't take breaks. They're the ones who don't take breaks. Professionals take breaks. That breaks are not a deviation from our performance. They are part of our performance. And so we also know a lot more about breaks in that we know what kinds of breaks are most restorative. So we know that social breaks are better than solo breaks. We know that breaks when you move are better than breaks when you're sedentary. We know that actually that nature, being outside, being able to see trees and grass, et cetera, is incredibly restorative. We know that we need to be fully detached rather than semi-detached. And so for me, circling back to your question about how this has changed what I do, I now every day in the afternoon make a break list where I write down 2 breaks I'm going to take. I write down what time I'm going to take it, and I write down what I'm going to do. And so I have fully integrated breaks into my life, and it's made a big difference. For me, that's a big transformation.
And how long are your breaks?
My breaks are not super long. I'm talking like 15-minute breaks. Now I will take other breaks along but what I want to do is so much of sort of our takeaways on this body of research is the importance of being intentional. And so on a big level, we're very intentional in certain aspects of our life. What we do, we always have a to-do list. Who we do it with. Companies have HR departments. How we do it. We're education and training departments inside of companies. But we're less intentional about when we do things. And we sort of have seated when at the kids' table, and it belongs at the grown-up table. Even on a day-to-day basis, time of day explains about 30% of the variance in human performance on workplace tasks. So it makes a huge difference. And we have to be intentional. We have to take these when questions seriously. And the same thing is true with breaks. So what I do for this break list is I want to make sure that I'm intentional. So I have 2 breaks. I write down the time. I schedule them the way I would schedule a meeting or a phone call. And I write down what I'm going to do. And so I know that I'm going to have at least 2 decent coherent breaks in the afternoon if I'm intentional about it.
Okay. And now what about the morning? I'm just curious why you don't schedule them in the morning. Or do you?
I schedule them in the afternoon for this reason. I schedule them in the afternoon because I know that, it's based on the research too. We know that the day moves in 3 stages. There's a peak, a trough, a recovery. For most of us, it moves in that order. So the morning is the peak. That's when we're better at analytic work. The trough is just a disaster in general. We should be doing our administrative work then. And the late afternoon for most of us, early evening is a recovery where we're better off doing creative kind of work. So during the analytic work, during the morning peak, I will take breaks. I mean, I will take maybe a 5-minute break, especially when I'm writing. So I'm sort of strained. I hit a wall. And so I'll go and I'll take a 10-minute break to go to the bathroom, get a cup of coffee, walk around a little bit. So there's sometimes in the mornings in my peak when I can work 90 minutes straight and I don't have a deleterious effect on my performance. But in the afternoon, I know that can't be the case. And so that's why I'm very intentional in the afternoons. And all of my breaks in the afternoons, mostly weather permitting, involve going outside and taking a walk because we know that, as I said before, moving and being in nature is especially restorative.
Sure. So, I'm a big believer in scheduling workouts, and I love to work out in the morning mostly. But so I'm sort of asking this question selfishly. When is the best time to work out and sort of why based on your research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of those things that yields actually a very, very specific answer. When you should work out in the day really depends on your goals. We should work out in the morning if we want to establish a routine. There's evidence showing that we're more likely to adhere to a workout routine if we do it in the morning. We should work out in the morning if we want to lose weight. There's a lot of good evidence you actually will lose more weight with a morning workout than a little bit more weight than with a morning workout than with an evening workout. The other thing is, as all of us know, exercise is a very good mood booster. And the mood boost from exercise actually lasts a fairly long time. And so if you exercise in the morning, you get a mood boost that lasts for, throughout a lot of the day. If you exercise later in the day, you end up sleeping through some of the mood boosts. So that's the reason to exercise in the morning. Exercising in the afternoon, though, has virtues too. It depends on your goals. Exercise in the afternoon if you want to avoid injury. I had no idea about this. There's a surprisingly large effect of our body temperature and its changes over the day. Our body temperature changes very predictably over the day. Our body temperature rises in the hits essentially peak in the late afternoon. As a consequence, we are literally more warmed up. And so we're less likely to suffer injury. Tied to that is, and this is the reason I am an afternoon, early evening workout person, is we tend to enjoy it more, or it feels less effortful, in part because we're warmed up. Again, anecdotal mine. I have exercise in the morning. I find it like I'm working much harder when I exercise in the morning versus in the afternoon. And in the afternoon, it feels a little less effortful. People actually end up reporting enjoying their workouts more in the afternoon. The other thing that's actually really kind of interesting, there's some evidence showing that we perform a little bit better. And I'm keen to watch the Winter Olympics on this. There are a couple of papers out there that indicate, that show a disproportionate number of records in speed events like speed skating, swimming, sprinting, only in speed events. Disproportionate number of records were made between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., the local time of the event. So that's one area. Like, and some of this stuff, some of the answers are, oh, it's a little bit better to do X or Y. But here, I think it really, on the workout times, it really, really divides up. And again, whatever you have to figure out your goals and then figure out your time. For me, I'm an afternoon exerciser, not because I'm looking for any kind of Olympic records, but because I really do enjoy it more. Exercising for me in the morning is a real strain.
Before we go back to today's conversation, I want to invite you to check out our new Game Changer negotiation workshops. Do failed negotiations result in a loss of profitability for you or your organization? Does your team lose deals simply because of a lack of experience? Would you benefit from simply accelerating the deal process? Then our Game Changer negotiation workshops are something you're going to want to check out. I negotiated deals for some of the top athletes and coaches in the world for nearly 2 decades. And what I learned is that negotiation is simply a conversation. Yes, it's a tough one, a strategic one, but it's a conversation. And if you have the right tools and the right framework, anyone can become an effective negotiator. That's why I'm bringing Game Changer negotiation training to you. Visit GameChanger360.com for more. So talk about sort of the fresh start effect, right? And maybe some examples of how we can leverage sort of the fresh start effect in our own lives, personally and professionally.
So the fresh start effect is a really interesting phenomenon that gives us some hints about when we should start certain kinds of behavior change. The big idea here, and this is research out of the University of Pennsylvania from Heng-Chen Dai and Katie Milkman and Jason Reese, what they found is that certain dates of the year operate as, this is the phrase that these researchers and others use, operate as temporal landmarks, okay? So just as landmarks in physical space serve a role, landmarks in time serve a role. And so what these temporal landmarks do is, number one, is they get us to slow down, just in the same way a physical landmark might. What they also do when they get us to slow down is they get us to engage in this really peculiar form of mental accounting. So when we think about a business at the beginning of a quarter, the beginning of a fiscal year, whatever, is going to open up a fresh ledger. They're going to sort of, okay, we're going to turn the page. We're going to have, new books for 2018 for Q2 or whatever. And we do that mentally on certain temporal landmarks. We say, okay, I'm going to relegate old me to the past, and I'm going to open a fresh ledger on new me. This is the whole phenomenon. This is the whole construct underneath New Year's resolutions. New Year's Day is a temporal landmark. Okay, turn the page, fresh ledger. But what's interesting is that there are other fresh start dates that we can use to trigger behavior change. So just to make it useful to your listeners, let's say you want to start a new diet or a new exercise regimen or something like that. You're better off starting it on a Monday rather than a Thursday, because a Monday is a fresh start date because it's the beginning of the week. You're better off doing it on the 1st of the month rather than on the 12th of the month. You're better off doing it on the day after your birthday rather than the day before your birthday. If you're in school, you're better off doing it on the first day of the semester rather than the 16th day of the semester. And so the idea here is that all dates are not created equal, and you can actually up your odds a little bit if you start your behavior change on one of these fresh start dates.
Wow, that is so interesting. I mean, it's so intriguing to think about it in a different way. I love that.
And the whole point, Molly, exactly, is that, what I want is I just want people to start thinking about this stuff. Because again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's like, okay, we think, okay, what do I need to do? I need to exercise. How am I going to do it? Oh, I'm going to join a gym. Who am I going to do it with? Maybe I get a personal trainer. But then we say, well, when am I going to start? Oh, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it does. The when questions matter a lot on a number of different dimensions of our life.
Sure. Well, you've broken it down, like you said early, right? With such depth. I mean, I would have never thought there was so much around the word when, right? We always think about how.
Oh my God, there's
why.
so much stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
There's a ton. In the book, you talk about larks and owls and third birds, and kind of how knowing sort of your chronotype, right, can help us determine kind of how to optimize our days and how to optimize ourselves. So can you tell me a little bit more about that and our listeners?
Yeah. So each of us has an innate biological lean toward, do we wake up early and go to sleep early? Do we wake up late and go to sleep late? So the first one are people, chronotype of sort of morning people and then evening people. We have about roughly 15% of the population are larks, like, really early people, wake up early, go to sleep early. About 20% are owls, wake up late, go to sleep late. But then again, most of us, 2/3 of us are kind of in the middle, not really strongly one way or another. And that ends up being the initial question one has to ask oneself in figuring out when to do stuff during the course of a day. So as I mentioned before, for larks and these middle group, what I call third birds, we tend to move generally through the day in these 3 stages: peak, trough, recovery. So that's, 4 out of 5 of us move in that direction. But for owls, it's a very different world. They tend to move in the opposite direction: recovery, trough, peak. And so knowing which one of these you are can help you find the way to do the right work at the right time. And one of the challenges is that our world is absolutely biased against owls. The world of work, the world of school is not intentionally anti-owl, but it's configured in a way that makes it difficult to be an owl.
Sure. So how do you figure out what you are? I mean, do you sort of know based on when you like to wake up and go to bed? I mean, is it that basic or? So
first of all, there are a couple ways. Number one is that there are 2 good, well-validated assessments out there. One is called the Munich Chronotype Questionnaire, which is a, sort of like a Myers-Briggs type questionnaire where you can fill out and get it. There's another one called the Horn-Ostberg questionnaire. But actually, the simplest way to do it is as follows. In fact, I can do it with you to figure out which one you are.
All right, let's do it. I'm in.
All right. So think about a day when you don't have to wake up to an alarm clock. So you're not trying to catch a plane. You're not going to an early morning meeting. You can just wake up anytime you want to wake up. The night before, what time would you typically go to sleep?
The truth is, this is borderline embarrassing, but sometime between 9 and 9:30 at night, I go to bed pretty early.
Okay, so even if you don't have to wake up to an alarm clock the next day, you'd go to bed at like, say, 9:30.
Yep.
Okay, cool. And then what time would you wake up?
Probably 7 plus or minus 7.
Okay, so let's say what we're trying to do is figure out your midpoint of sleep. So let's say you get up at, just to make the math a little bit easier, let's say we'll make it real. So let's say 7. So you're going to sleep from 9:30 to 7. Your midpoint of sleep would be 2 a.m. So you're definitely a lark. If your midpoint of sleep is 3:30 a.m. or before, you're a lark. If your midpoint of sleep is 5:30 a.m. or after, you're an owl. So you're a pretty strong lark, actually.
Sure.
Your midpoint of sleep is pretty early. So for me, I'm pretty much in the middle. So I would typically, and on a free day when I didn't have to get up, I would typically go to sleep about midnight, and I would wake up at 8. And so that would put my midpoint of sleep at 4, which makes me in the middle, but leaning a little bit more toward larks. And so for you, I mean, that's actually really important to know. So what you want to do, and all the larks among your fans, is again, you need to be intentional. So you're going to move through the day, peak, trough, recovery. So during your peak, which is going to be the morning, you want to do your analytic work, your work that requires heads down, focus, attention, batting away distractions, writing, analyzing, that kind of work. During the trough, which is the early afternoon, you want to do, as I mentioned before, kind of routine. Trough is a bad time for most things. You want to do your routine kind of work, your routine email, your filling out your expense reports and things like that. Later in the day, which is an intriguing time, this recovery period, what you have is you have better mood than during the trough, but you're actually less vigilant than during the peak. And so that makes it a good time. That combination of elevated mood and somewhat reduced inhibitions makes it a good time for creative work. And so for larks like you, a couple of things go on. Number one is that you don't want to take that peak time when you're better off doing that lockdown, heads down work. You don't want to spend that time in meetings. You don't want to spend that time answering stupid email. You want to preserve that time to do your best analytic work. By the same token, during your trough, you don't want to try to do your analytic work then. You want to move your routine work then. And then later in the day, do your creative work. And the problem is that it's twofold. One, as individuals, we're not very intentional about that. Two, many of us don't have full control over our schedule. So our bosses are making us go to these, like a ridiculous meeting about travel vouchers at 9:30 in the morning and squandering that peak time, when we should be having that boring meeting about travel vouchers during the trough because it's less urgent. When we think about scheduling, we just basically look for like logistics and convenience, but we don't think about scheduling certain kinds of meetings at certain times of day. For instance, I was talking to one company just last week, and they were saying, oh yeah, we do our product, basically our feedback and new ideas for products. I mean, sort of ideas for how to improve products at 2 p.m. We just did it at 2 p.m. It didn't go very well. And I said, yeah, because it's at 2 p.m. You want to do a creative thing like that, push it later in the day. Do it at 4:30.
Yep. Okay. Do you have to honor kind of what someone is, right? So I'm thinking about my oldest daughter. Okay, because my husband is definitely an owl. One of our daughters is, I think, an owl. I've got another one that's a lark. I mean, and do you need to honor that and allow that to be who they are and let them sort of own that and show up in that way?
Absolutely. That's a hugely important point.
Don't try to make an owl a lark and vice versa. Let it go.
No, you can't.
Yeah,
you can't.
Okay, got
it's like saying you're a basketball coach and you have a player who is 6'1", and you say, oh, I really wish you were 6'6" because I need a forward.
Right.
It's like, no, it's like, so they're 6'1". You can't do anything about that. What you do is you play the best 6'1" position you possibly can. And again, I don't think that bosses necessarily honor that. And it really disadvantages owls. So bosses will make owls come in for an 8 o'clock staff meeting or something like that. And owls just want to beat their heads against the wall for that. There's also big effects. You mentioned, how old is your daughter?
We have 3 15 and 14-year-old twins.
Okay. Oh, my Lord. Okay. So our chronotypes changes over time, too. It's hinged in part on age.
Okay.
I have a 15-year-old son and a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old. What you see is around the ages of 14, kids undergo a dramatic change in their chronotype. Like little kids, as you know, as a mom, are incredible larks. They get up really early. They get up irritatingly early and just start running around like crazy people. But around the age of 14 or so, there's a dramatic change. And so people's chronotype shift 2, sometimes 3 hours later. So just naturally, they wake up later and go to sleep later. And that period of peak owliness lasts until about age 24. And the trouble is, if you think about our schools, we start school way too early for teenagers.
That's what I was just going to say, right.
This is why you have the American Academy of Pediatrics issuing a policy statement back in just a couple of years ago, telling schools, this is basically the nation's pediatrician saying, please, 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 do not start school for teenagers before 8:30 in the morning. And yet the average school start time in America today is 8:03. It's a really, really bad idea. And what's interesting is that the school districts that have changed the start time have seen very impressive results, higher test scores, lower dropout rates, even fewer teen car accidents. And so again, we've been talking a lot about decision-making at the individual level, at the organizational level, but even at the policy level, we need to take into account more of these when questions.
And so like when you think about schools and when we think about our corporate culture, right, sort of this 9 to 5, are we getting that wrong too?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends. I mean, 9 to 5 is lovely for larks and for a lot of third birds, but it's less good for owls. So that's one thing. And so you want to have a little bit more slack for owls. The owls might be better off coming in far later, doing their creative work between 10 and 1, doing their administrative work between 1 and 3:30, and then really starting in earnest their analytic work from 4 until, say, 9 at night. And you see that a lot in certain technology companies that have younger people who are owls who are doing their core heads down work from 5 p.m. to midnight. And I think you want to accommodate that. The other thing that you want to do, even if you do 9 to 5, is make sure that to the extent possible, you're putting the right work in the right time. And as we were talking about earlier, Molly, you're allowing people to have sufficient breaks and the right kinds of breaks.
Sort of switching gears a little bit, right? So we're talking about work and workout. So let's talk about this. Like breakfast, has often been talked about the most important meal of the day, right? And I mean, I'm always trying to get my girls to make sure that they eat something before they leave.
Yeah.
We have a lot of busy professionals listening to this podcast who maybe skip breakfast or lunch or they eat lunch at their desk, right? What does the research show about breakfast and lunch?
So interesting. So we always think that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And what the research shows, if you look at the research to answer the question, is breakfast the most important meal of the day? The answer is a definitive maybe. And the research on breakfast, I think, is a little bit mixed. It doesn't certainly say you should never have breakfast. Breakfast is a waste. I think it's not totally clear. So my view is and I'm a breakfast eater. So I had breakfast this morning. So have breakfast if you want, skip it if you don't want. I think that in some ways, breakfast is overvalued, but I think that lunch is undervalued. There's some interesting new research on lunch showing that taking a lunch away from one's desk can have big boosts in our productivity and our creativity. And it doesn't have to be, we're not talking like 2.5 hour martini soaked lunch. We're talking about just, a half an hour away from your desk, not sitting at your desk, deleting your email and munching on a tuna sandwich. If you think about lunch as a subset of the overall category of breaks, what you need full detachment. And that comes out a lot in it. So what you want to do is you want to, take a half an hour for lunch, leave your desk. Some good research that social breaks are more restorative than individual solo breaks, even for introverts. Find someone who you like, have a half hour lunch away from your desk, and that ends up having a huge benefit to your mood, to your creativity, to your productivity. And a lot of times we're, sort of penny wise and pound foolish in that we say, I can't afford to leave for a half an hour. But what happens if you don't leave for a half an hour, your performance during the remaining 4 hours or 5 hours that you have to work is diminished. So what you can do is you can take a half an hour break and you're going to perform better during the remaining 4 hours. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about before about professionals and amateurs. I mean, athletes know this. Athletes don't work out and train without taking breaks. They take breaks because they know that their body, can't go on forever. And the same thing is true for those of us white collar athletes too. We need to have breaks. And you see this, I hate to be ranting, but you see this throughout just in so many different dimensions of performance. Anders Ericsson, guy who discovered this idea of deliberate practice, a certain way of practicing, he looked at elite performers in music. And what he found was that the top violinist, if you compare the top violinists with the next tier, the top violinists took more breaks than the other ones. That the best violinists were taking more breaks than the people who weren't as good. And they were doing certain kinds of things. They were actually focusing a lot in the morning and then essentially taking off the afternoon. Whereas the less skilled violinists were, I'm going to do a little morning, little, and they weren't as intentional and deliberate about when they practiced.
Mm-hmm. So some of the people listening maybe don't have full control of their schedule, right?
Right.
So what tweaks can they make? And then kind of on the flip side, right? So for the leaders that are listening, what can they do differently based on your findings with their own teams?
Yeah, it's great. It's two sides of the same coin there. So if you are an individual, and again, I have a lot of empathy more for owls than I did before I started doing this work. Let's say you're an owl and you have to go to a 8:00 meeting. Okay, that's torture. But what can you do? So I think there are a few things that you could do. Number one is the night before, I would make a checklist. Like, what are the 3 things you need to accomplish at this meeting? What do you need to say? What do you need to get done? What you need to confirm? Whatever. Write that down. Make a little checklist and bring it with you to the meeting so you don't space out. So you don't have to rely on your foggy, analytic mind at 8:00 in the morning. So have that with you. The second thing that I would do is I would do something to boost your mood before you go into that 8:00 meeting. So a couple of ideas on that. One would be take a walk around the block before you go in. So instead of just racing into the office, throwing down your bag and running to the conference room, take a walk around the block because we know movement and nature can be restorative, give you a little bit more replenishing. The other thing that I think is really interesting are the replenishing effects and the mood boosting effects of doing something nice for somebody, of good deed. So maybe do a good deed for very modest good deed. So if you're, in line to buy coffee buy it for the stranger behind you, or, bring someone in your office a cup of coffee, or this is a small good deed will be a mood booster. So I think if you do those kind of things, you can work the margins a little bit. Beyond that, I do think that, to your other point, Molly, about bosses, I do think that it's worth having that bosses and employees should have this conversation about the when of their work. When are you most productive? When are you better able to do certain kinds of work? And I think that bosses should give people cover so they can do the right work at the right time. I mean, if you think about it, there are a lot of bosses, let's say you complain, say, oh, my chair is terrible, it's falling apart and it hurts my back. I think a lot of bosses would say, okay, great, we'll get you a new chair. But if you say, I'm a lark, and I really do my best heads down work between 8:30 in the morning and 11:30 in the morning, and yet I'm being forced to do all this administrative garbage and go to meetings, so I'm squandering my time. Is there anything you can do about that, boss? The boss should treat it the same way they would a broken chair, saying, of course, we'll get that fixed.
Right. Sure. They want to give them every resource to win.
Right, exactly.
Wow, no, that's really interesting. And so if you have a team with some larks and owls, I mean, do you sort of have to just
that gets complicated?
Yeah, because most people have probably a little bit of both.
It depends on what you want to do. So let's say there's certain kinds of meetings. So let's take a meeting. Let's say you have a meeting about some very thorny analytic problem. That's better for larks to do in the morning, and it's better for owls to do later in the day. But remember, most of us are a little bit in between. We're a little bit more like larks. So if you have an analytic meeting, you probably want to have it. Yeah, exactly. You want to have it in the morning. But on the other hand, there's certain kinds of meetings that you want to have different perspectives in. So you can mix the larks and owls there. I don't think that when it comes to grouping people together, there's going to be a perfect solution. But I do think that bosses can be, as I keep saying, can be a little bit more intentional about those kinds of choices and who does what when. It becomes more complicated. It's a harder problem to solve, actually. And when you're talking about the case now in many, many companies where you have people in, radically different time zones, different countries, who are trying to coordinate. That's a very, very thorny problem. And it's not anything that our brains are really wired for. Our brains evolved to survive on the African savannah, and we didn't expect ever to be, and we only expect to be collaborating with people who are in our tribe and in small nomadic bands. When you're talking about, hey, I got to coordinate with this dude in London and this woman in Singapore, and then this guy in Phoenix, it becomes very, very challenging for our caveman, cavewoman brains.
Sure. So a couple more, Daniel. I spend a lot of time talking about time too, right? As it relates to, we live in this world, right? That's very time-based, right? And people are constantly scheduling things and trying to maximize every minute. But I believe we sort of have to make sure we bring our energy to our time, or the way we spend our time isn't as optimal, which is, I think, a little bit of what I'm hearing. So tell me a little bit about what came up for you through this research around energy and time. And I
think that that's the core of this idea, that we have, that our mood follows this pattern, peak trough recovery, and that our performance follows that. And at some level, it is about energy. So we have more analytic, intellectual energy during our peak period. And so we should be doing that kind of work then. We have a little bit more creative energy during our recovery period. So we should be doing that kind of work at that time of day. And so
the when dictates the energy is really what we've been talking about.
Right. Because our energy levels, and again, depending on how you define energy, anything from mental acuity to wakefulness to literally body temperature, our energy levels are not going to be the same every time of the day. It's not like this hotel room that I'm sitting in when I'm talking to you by phone, where I can basically set the thermostat. It's like, okay, 70 degrees. It's going to be 70 degrees any time of day or night because I set it there. Our bodies aren't like that. We have our energy levels wax and wane during the day. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to be intentional about deploying the right resources at the right time.
I have always admired your work so much, Dan, and you've
Thank you.
You're it's so fun to connect in this way. And you've written some incredible books, right, that have all done remarkably well. And you ask so many important questions and then go wide and deep on those questions. So I guess one of the things that comes up for me is, how do you know what book is worth writing? How do you know what question is worth asking and what's worth your time to go deep in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think I have a super systematic answer for that. But what I do for any book is and here I might have to get into the weeds a little bit. For any book, what I will do is I'll have ideas for books that I'll keep in a file that I'll return to periodically. And then a lot of times I have an idea, I throw it into a file, I come back to it 6 months later, and it's like, okay, that's the worst idea I ever heard. I hope nobody ever sees that. And so, the only way I'm convinced that this is not anything new, but the only way to have good ideas is to have a lot of ideas. And so when you have a lot of ideas, you have a lot of bad ideas. So I think you have to be willing to have bad ideas, which believe me, I have plenty of. So generate those ideas. And then what I'll find is that maybe 2 or 3 of them end up sticking around for a while. And what I'll do to more directly answer your question is I will start writing a proposal for a book. Here's what this book is about. Here's who it would reach. Here's how I would organize it. And, maybe a 30, 40-page proposal. And this proposal does... it's nominally for my publisher to say, hey, what do you think of this? But it's really for me, because when I start writing and thinking about stuff, a lot of times things don't hang together. So I'll give you an example about, this is a while ago, over 10 years ago. I wanted to write a book proposal, and I sent my wife and our 3 kids to visit my in-laws in December. And I said, listen, you guys go away for 2 weeks. I'm going to knock out this proposal because I really got to get it done. And so after 10 days, I called my wife. I said, I've got some good news and bad news. The good news is that you can come home. The bad news is that this is not a book. It took me, trying to write a book proposal to realize this was not going to hold up. It was not going to hold up conceptually, and it wasn't anything I wanted to be working on. And so I've written, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 book proposals.
That you use for the bonfire?
Exactly. But those are some of the most important things that I've written, because they prevented me from going down the wrong path. So I want to discover that something isn't really a good book before I sign the contract rather than after. Or I want to discover, hey, I'm not really all that interested in this idea. I want to know that early rather than late, before I've said, hey, I'm going to write a book about rutabagas, and then not discovering that I actually hate rutabagas.
Well, no, I've always said, right, that the more no's you get, the closer you get to getting a yes. So
Totally.
I think that's really cool. So you have been so generous with your time, Dan, and so we end with these rapid fire questions. So
okay, hit me.
Are you ready to go? I already know, your lark owl deal. So question, what is your morning and evening routine?
Okay, my morning routine when I'm writing is I get to my office at about, I work in the garage behind my house. As I said, I'm a sort of an intermediate person, a little larky, but not crazy. So on writing days, I get to my office at 8:30. I give myself a quota of words. I say, you have to write 600 words today. And I will turn off my email, turn off my phone, ban myself from doing anything else until I hit that 600 word mark. Once I hit that 600 word mark, I am free to do other things. And I find that discipline is essential, because if you write 600 words a day, 6 or 7 days a week for a while, the pages start to pile up.
And you wake up and you have a book or 2 or 3.
I almost always take a short lunch break, maybe a half an hour. And then in the early afternoons, I really do a lot of my administrative work. When I'm researching, I like to do my interviews. When I interview people, I like to do those like late afternoon, because I like my interviews to be a little bit more freewheeling. I tend to exercise usually fairly early evening, maybe 6:30, 7, somewhere around there. And then I always have dinner with my family, although we now only have 1 kid at home, so it's a smaller dinner. So I have dinner with my family. And then in the evening, I don't know, I'm not a very exciting person. I don't go out all that much. In the evening, I'll, read and hang out with my wife, and go to sleep on weekdays, I don't know, maybe like 11 or so.
Okay. What's the last book you read?
The last book I read was a great novel called The Power by Naomi Alderman, which is a work of science fiction about a world where women are in charge, and it's really freaking good.
Well, that sounds like an amazing book, Dan. I need to get that.
It's a great book.
Man.
You got to check it out. The Power by Naomi Alderman. It's sort of like it's like this generation's Handmaid's Tale.
Love it. I'm writing it down. Okay, so the app you use most often?
I think it would be Dropbox. My entire life is on Dropbox, so I use the Dropbox app on my phone quite a bit. Let me just see what I have here on my phone. It's a great question. I've never thought about that before. What else do I use?
Twitter. We have a little groove on Twitter.
Twitter, yeah, a little bit. I would say Dropbox.
What's the best advice you've ever gotten?
The best advice I ever gotten. As a writer, the best advice I ever got was from an editor maybe 25 years ago who I was struggling to write. I'd written a draft of a long magazine article, and it wasn't there, and I knew it wasn't there, even though, and I moved it to him, and I knew it wasn't there. He knew it wasn't there, and he asked me this question. He said, "Think about this. What's the promise you're making to the reader? What's the promise you're making to the reader?" And that really changed the way I thought about writing. So the idea is like, and I think about that all the time. What promise am I making to the reader when I write something? So that's the best. That's some of the best advice I've gotten. I've collected a lot of advice over the years, little shards of advice, but that's the first one that comes to mind.
Well, you probably live a curious life, right? I mean, you're always learning and listening.
Trying to.
Yeah. What's one thing on your bucket list?
I would like to go to Antarctica.
All right. Well, go in the summer.
Yeah. Thanks for the advice, Molly. Yeah, thanks.
That's just a profound little thought there.
Yeah.
So, this show is called Game Changers. And so one last question for you. Who's a game changer that inspires you and why?
I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose, but a game changer who's inspired me is Nelson Mandela. Obviously, I'm not anywhere close to that degree of significance. But what I find remarkable about him was his ability to just endure all those years in prison and then come back and not be vindictive. And there's something about that to me is like, okay, that's what it means to be a moral person. That's what it means to be a good person. So I think that I'm going big with that choice here, Mandela.
Yeah, I love it. So Dan, thanks so much. You are a gift to so many people. Your work is inspiring.
Thank you, Molly.
I love it.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's really fun.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.